Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to the Indian Express's first e-Adda. As some of you know, the Express Adda is a space for a patient conversation with a newsmaker to engage with the community and an intellectually curious audience such as yourselves. Our number of registrations this morning crossed 1,000, and I'm not surprised. We're all tense about the economy. Both employers and employees are wondering where the next paycheck will come from. And all of this has happened in a matter of months. Now, there are very few people who have the experience to walk us through all this economic uncertainty. Arvind Subramanian is just handful of those people. He has served as India's chief economic advisor from 2014 to 2018. He's worked closely with former Finance Minister Arun Jaitley in the rollout of the goods and services tax and the direct benefit transfer scheme. Dr. Subramanian, my personal gratitude to you will always be for simplifying the readability of the economic survey. That's one document which I feel I've always been so intimidated by. So I think that's one thing that we have you to thank. He will be interviewed by my colleagues Harish Damodaran, National Editor, Rural Affairs and Agriculture, and Vaidyanathan Iyer, Executive Editor, National Affairs. A quick thank you to our sponsor, UCO Bank, and to all of you who have made the time to join us. Very warm welcome. And with a short prayer to the internet gods, Vaidi, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Subramanian, it's really a pleasure to have you with us from Boston. Dr. Subramanian, if I may request, or if you would like to make a few short comments on setting the stage for the discussion, and give the context and the background to the economy in these times of crisis.
Okay. First of all, thanks very much to Anant, the Indian Express, Harish, Vaidi, all of you, Raj, for having me. It's a real pleasure to come on the show. Or whatever we may want to call it. I think we should quickly get into the discussion, but I just think it's worth remembering a few things, or just by way of context and background. I just want to set out 5 kind of broad thoughts here that should inform everything that we think about. I think first and foremost is that this is a very, very unusual crisis that the world faces and India faces. I don't want to go through all the details. It's very severe. It's very sudden. It's very new territory. So the first point is that there is so much uncertainty on everything, how the pandemic is going to evolve, how people are going to respond, what policies are going to happen, that, we are really shooting in the dark, and that's something that I think we should all keep in mind. A corollary of that is that, in this business today for governments around the world, there are just no good choices. The choices span from the bad to the very, very bad or disastrous. So I think we should be a little bit careful, therefore, about, how we assess all these things, because this is just an awful situation to be in, both on the health side and kind of the economic side. So that's I think point number 2. Point number 3, I think it's important, to remember that because of this uncertainty, every country is responding very differently, both in terms of the health and in terms of the economic response. But I think there is a growing consensus around people who think about this very carefully, that regardless of how advanced countries are weighing this trade-off between lives and livelihoods, and especially as it informs how the exit from the lockdown should happen, I think there is a sense that, those trade-offs are different for developing countries like India. The hardship is greater, the ability to protect them is weaker in countries like India, the health capacity is not as good, the ability to even enforce severe lockdown policies is more difficult. Therefore, I think the trade-off for countries like India, it is only fair that and appropriate that it should err a little bit on the side of, should be different from that in advanced countries, and err more on the side of, prioritizing the present and preserving livelihoods and so on. So as we, I think, talk about the exit discussion, we should keep that in mind. However, I think this is something we can categorically say is that any exit from lockdown, however we do it, different states are going to do it differently. I think backing it up with comprehensive and ramped up testing is absolutely essential. That's what's going to determine how much we can ease, where we can ease, and how we can sustain it. So I think testing. Now, last 2 points I want to say about India is that what was different about India about this crisis is that, of course, it's going to be very severe all around the world. But even before this crisis hit India, our economy was weakening quite substantially. Josh Feldman and I wrote a paper in December, and our financial system was actually quite fragile. We'll talk about that later. So this crisis, in a sense, comes on top of already weakening economy, which is what I think makes the Indian situation maybe even a little bit even more difficult and challenging than other countries. The last point I would make is that what this crisis is showing, of course, is that, the states, while the center has a lot of coordination to do, the states are in the front line of the response on the health side, on the social safety side, managing the migrants, which we should talk about. Therefore, I think center state, coordination, cooperation in this, and some of it seems to be happening, is of the utmost priority in India. And I think we should not forget this as we talk about this going forward. So,
yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian. Before I even ask my first question, I just request all our viewers to send questions. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom app on which you can type in your questions, so that we'll be able to take note of that, and Dr. Subramanian will be able to answer some of them. Thank you. Dr. Subramanian, absolutely, the economy was tottering, and last 2 years at least, the growth has been slowing down sharply. So in the current financial year, that is 2020-21, how do you see the economy growing? Do you see that we are headed for a contraction in growth for the first time in about 40 years?
Yeah, I think that let's just focus a little bit on substance and numbers. If you look at what the IMF is forecasting for the advanced countries, it's on average a slowdown of 8.5%. So, for example, the US from say 2 to 6.5 or 6. So an 8.5 percentage point difference is what it's forecasting for many of the advanced economies. Now, if you look at India, just keep that as a benchmark and see how we should think about this. I don't want to come to any specific numbers. So 8.5% decline essentially roughly means the IMF is saying that for all the advanced economies, 1 month of GDP will be lost. That's roughly mota the calculation. Now, India was already weakening, 1. 2, I think the kind of lockdown policies in India have not been, any less severe than in the advanced countries. And finally, India has a fiscal response of less than 1% of GDP, whereas on average, the advanced countries have a response of 8.5% of GDP so far. If you put all these together, I cannot see how, even allowing for the fact that India is a more dynamic economy, how India's growth rate cannot decline by the orders of magnitude that the IMF is projecting for the advanced countries. I think the IMF's forecasts for India are absolutely mystifying and bizarre. I think I would say that there are very, very imprudent basis on which to plan the response, or almost kind of lulls us into false complacency. I think prudence demands, just looking at the numbers I've told you, that we should plan for, negative, maybe substantially negative growth rates in this financial year.
Arvind, you spoke of a fiscal stimulus to the extent of about 8.5% of GDP in advanced countries. How much of a stimulus can India afford? How much percentage of GDP? And how much of it can be monetized? Because a lot of people are saying that the RBI should print money. And we stopped. I think RBI stopped this issuing ad hoc treasury bills way back in 1997. And the fact that the rupee is not a reserve currency. It's easy for the U.S. Federal Reserve to increase its balance sheet from $7 trillion to $13 trillion and produce no inflation, etc. How much do you think it is practically possible to monetize, and how much should be the stimulus as a percentage of GDP? If it is right now, it is 1%. How much? And if it is 8.5% elsewhere, what is the ballpark according to you?
So Harish, if you don't mind, let's break that up into what should be the overall magnitude of the fiscal response. Second, how much should be financed from different sources, including from the RBI, what you call printing money deficit financing. And then the third issue in India, which is very important also, is, how should that financing be allocated between the center and the states? It's turning out to be a very, very important issue because of it. So let's take these three kind of one at a time. First, about the magnitudes. So let's look at it first from the need point of view rather than, the affordability point of view, right? I think because that has to be the starting point. I mean, the scale of the hardship is so enormous that, need has to be how we at least begin the conversation. Now, so they've spent 8.5, and, I know every country is different, but what we said was that, supposing you look at the healthcare response that's required, right? Then the social safety net, the cushioning, and then maybe stimulus. So these are the three things that we may need to do. And the number that Devesh Kapoor had came out, some very conservative numbers, was that the extra spending would need to be something like 5% of GDP. Now remember, extra spending need not be extra deficit. We'll come to that in just a second. But something like, 5, this is not a kind of, magic number, but it's some number around that, people can talk about. So we need to find about 5% of GDP today is like 10 lakh crores. That's what I think we need to find for this year. Now, affordability, right? Because as it is, the economy is weakening, revenues are going to come down. So it will translate into substantially higher deficits. And so then let's confront, the affordability question, right?
I think 5%. This 5%, the center and states, or just
combined? No, combined. For the country as a whole. For the country as a whole, 10 lakh crores, the country as a whole, and then we'll talk about how to allocate that. So, how should one think about whether we can afford it or not? I think a broad principle. So, as you said, we are not a rich country. We're not a reserve currency country. So, our space is not unlimited. And you will notice what is very interesting is that all our former central bankers, or many of them, Governor Patel, Subbarao, I think others have also kind of come down on the side of saying, look, if you do too much down the road, our ratings go down, our debt gets out of control, and so the economy is in trouble. So my response to that is that in this case, we should be driven by need, and we can afford it. And let me take some of the broader concerns. One is that our credit rating will go down, and that's going to be hurt us going forward. Now remember that this is a situation that all countries are confronting. Point one. So it's not as if India, by spending 5%, is going to suddenly become more irresponsible than other countries. Second, I think remember that the whole deficit financing and all these issues arise if people think suddenly we've become irresponsible. The whole, have we got into trouble because we were irresponsible? In this case, categorically around the world, we know this is an exogenous shock nobody was responsible for. Therefore, some sense that, oh my God, this reflects profligacy, irresponsibility, which is what drives ratings, I think is less of a concern in this case. Finally, I think we have to be clear that how we are perceived after the crisis will depend upon how we behave after the crisis. If government policy is reasonably responsible going forward, which I think it will be, then I think affordability is not an issue. So I think we can afford this. Then the second question is finance. Where should it come from? I think, it should come from a variety of sources. Devesh and I set out 5 things. One is from abroad, NRIs, multilateral institutions. Then we said, also some cuts in expenditure, which many states have already done. Maybe some solidarity taxes, which we can talk about at the end. And then, of course, the 2 things are, printing money and issuing more bonds to the public. So I think we need to do everything, all of the above, so as to not burden any one sector or any one group of countries. Now let's take head on your question of deficit financing. Now, the concern about deficit financing, I think, and remember, we have to take these concerns seriously. Any responsible government cannot just say, we're going to print money, etc., etc. We have to be responsible. But I think here this can be done responsibly. How? The concern is twofold. One, it is unprecedented, as you said. Therefore, does it mean suddenly we're going to break all convention and become irresponsible? So that's one concern. The second concern, of course, the difference with advanced countries is that we are not, advanced countries, they're trying for 10 years to raise inflation. They've not been able to. We are, of course, still not a very high inflation country, but we're not a 0.1%. We're in the 4 to 7% in the last 3 years, you'll see. So it is a concern. So I think we have to be careful about that. And finally, I think also there's a huge overhang of liquidity already in the market, which people are worried about. So I think those are the concerns which we should take seriously. My response to that would be, look, one, it seems like this is going to be a deflationary shock, that for some time at least, prices are going to be lower rather than higher. So I think that we should keep in mind. Second, I think that we can finance some part of it responsibly, but making clear that it's one-off. This is not going to be repeated again and again. And why I think that's credible is that this government is a kind of conservative, reasonably low inflation policy. So this is not going to suddenly lead to, deficit financing going forward again and again. So I think that's a very important consideration for thinking that, if we do financing, it will not be printing money. It won't be responsible. It will be one-off, so it can be checked. And finally, I think remember that which comes now to the states question, I think one of the quickest and easiest ways of getting money to the states, I think the center and maybe the 15th Finance Commission need to reconsider how much the needs of the states are and think about that. But meanwhile, one of the quickest ways of getting money to the states would be to increase their deficit financing via the RBI. So bottom line is that yes, we have to be careful, we have to be responsible. But, my bigger thing is this: we save and do all these things for a rainy day. When a rainy day comes, you have to spend. This is not a rainy day. This is a deluge. It's like, in the Hindu pralaya. This is pralaya in terms of economic things. So if you're not going to find the resources now, given the the need and the hardship, what is all this kind of prudence for, if not to actually save for a rainy day or to spend for a rainy day?
Arvind, see, you said about that this is a pralay kind of a thing, where we need many umbrellas. Do you think see, like there were these three traditional constraints which India used to have, the three Fs, food, forex, and fuel. In this case, our food stocks are all-time high, fuel prices are very low, and forex actually hasn't come down much. I mean, the rupee has been stable. To what extent these can be useful in today's context, unlike past pralayas, as you call it?
Yeah. See, I think, Harish, that's a very good question, because I think there are two dimensions to this, right? In a sense, if you think about even our deficit financing, our monetary financing, the fact of food, the fact that fuel prices have collapsed, and the fact that our currency doesn't collapse because of reserves means that the inflationary concern going forward is much less, because these are the three big sources of inflation, right? Food prices going up, fuel prices going up, currency going down. And we have, so in a sense, that's a kind of insurance and buffer that we have in order to, be a little bit more, ambitious and bold in our response to the crisis. The second way in which, of course, this is very important is that, it's turning out that our food stocks are turning out to be the most effective, quickest, efficient, equitable social safety net that we have. Because remember, in this situation, the two social safety nets or two dimensions are food and cash. Cash, I think, is proving a little bit more difficult to get to people's hands because of bank accounts, the last mile problem. But because we have both the stocks and this public distribution system, we've been able to roll it out very much. So I think these are the ways in which the three Fs that you've so eloquently written about, I think, come in really handy. But I will say one thing, and I don't know whether you will agree, that our stocks have been a boon this year. But I mean, just like you save for a rainy day, this is pralay. I think these stocks have to come down, and they have to be distributed as quickly as possible. I think we can't come out of this crisis with even more stocks of food because of a combination of not having used it enough, and the bumper harvest kind of the kharif adding to it. So and it's actually we don't have the capacity. It's really everything coming together says push the food out. For the moment, give people food. Without ration cards, give it free, so that it's actually killing many birds with one stone.
Arvind, one thing which you advocated, and rightfully so, was on the power of JAM, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and mobile Trinity. Do you think, given the times that we are in, where migrant workers are stranded, and the vulnerable sections are facing huge problems, could the government have used the power of this Trinity better, unleashed it in a more comprehensive manner to alleviate sufferings? Because
I think that's a very good question. You see, I think that, as I said, food and cash were the two most easiest, quickest things to cushion, to provide the social insurance that we had. I think food is happening now. Then I think we could do much more on cash, much more. The problem is the following, right? The problem is that although we say, JAM, and I think it's one of the major achievements of this government to have done the plumbing and the architecture for JAM, I think they deserve a lot of credit. I think even just the opening of the accounts for every household is just a kind of a revolutionary thing, which I think was. The problem is that there is still a last mile problem, right? That either because of difficult terrain, or because there aren't enough ATMs, or because banking correspondents are not enough, the ability of people to actually access things is still nowhere close to 100%, right? But I think this is a situation where, one shouldn't worry so much about what the leakages are, what the inadequacies. I think this is a time, because it's pralay, to actually send the cash, send the money, and hope that at least a lot of it will reach those we intend to reach. Because I think the migrants, for example, I think their ability to access cash will also be, I think, limited. But I think you shouldn't worry at this stage about who's a farmer, who's poor, who's a woman, because we can't afford that luxury at this stage. Just pump the money through the system, while at the same time trying to improve it. I think we should try and do that. But this is our food and cash are our two things. A last point I would make on this, which I think maybe needs to be emphasized, especially in the light of all the policy decisions were taken. I think this is also a time when it's not just transferring money to bank accounts. This is a time when people need cash, currency. So I think we should not be reluctant to actually pump out this cash, so that, because people feel comfortable, the poor especially, they need the currency, they want the currency. I think so. It's not just about sending it to bank accounts, but also so that they can access it easily via cash. I think it's very important. Cash, I think we forget how important it is for the poor.
Yeah. Arvind, one more thing, but you explained, how there could be various modes of financing the deficit, that, if an additional 10 lakh crore has to be kind of organized, and, how can we do that? But today, I think, how do you split it amongst, say, the beneficiaries? How do you identify the beneficiaries? One is, of course, the poor, the unorganized sector workers, the vulnerable, right? The other is, which you have, also talked about very elaborately in your survey, about the twin balance sheet issue with the formal corporate sector and the banking sector. Corporates' debt overhang is huge. Banks are still struggling with NPAs, which are piling up, probably staring at one more round of fresh NPAs. Now you have the NBFC. There is a huge problem of liquidity for NBFCs. Banks are not really giving liquidity to NBFCs. Mutual funds, redemption pressure. That is another cylinder which is firing. So how do you apportion the kind of 5% deficit that you talked about, which we can take on our books?
Yeah. So I think that, remember, in terms of the response, there's the health response, there's the social insurance, there's the stimulus, and then the fourth thing is, how do we, what do we do about broadly the production and the financial side? That's kind of, and it's good that we're turning to that. I think that, remember, we started talking about the twin balance sheet challenge. Then in December, we spoke about the 4 balance sheet challenge. Now it's almost as if, and I don't mean to sound facetious, it's almost as if it will be easier to count the balance sheets that are not challenged than the balance sheets that are challenged, because the problem is proliferating because of the shock. So I think that helping the financial sector and the corporate sector is absolutely critical. Now, here's, I think, the first issue. And by the way, this has to come not just from the government, but also from the RBI. And I think, to be fair to the RBI, I think they've taken a number of good steps. The problem, however, is the following, that essentially what the RBI has done is to lower rates and make liquidity much more abundantly available, right? That's necessary, possibly. But what we need is actual credit flowing to the entire corporate sector. Small firms, medium-sized firms, big firms, everybody needs credit in this, because the more you get them credit, the more you will ensure that they will survive through the crisis and not come away with more permanent damage. So the dilemma is, liquidity is not credit. How do you actually get that credit pumping into the system? And to be fair, there are 2 problems with this, right? Why is it, it's not, it's easy for us to say, credit, but there are two problems with this, right? One, there was complete risk aversion even before this began because of all the problems in the financial system. Banks, they just did not want to lend because of risk aversion. Who's a good guy? Very few good borrowers left. The second problem, which I've spoken about a lot in the past, is the 4C problem, right? That is, there's a fear of lending because you may be, later on investigated. That problem has gotten worse now. If a banker was always reluctant to lend, imagine, say, asking him or her to lend to potentially very, dicey, borrowing situations. So the problem is going to be therefore aggravated. So I think the big question is, who takes the credit risk, and what are the detailed, very kind of, it's almost become like an organizational issue. How do you kind of categorize companies, and how do you get credit through them? In some cases, I think, the government will have to have a fund guaranteed or provided for this. In some cases, maybe the NBFCs who are, closer to the SMEs, they have a model where they can lend to SMEs. Maybe they should. But here's the thing, how do you make that work? First, I think some kind of reassurance should be given that decisions taken now will have a measure of protection that we have to. Otherwise, bankers are not going to take that. Second, I think the risk from those decisions should not be with the banks. They should either be with the government in the form of a completely separate fund, or maybe the RBI should take on that risk. And that's a tricky call. For example, if the RBI buys corporate bonds directly, some purists will be against it. But again, how we do it is kind of less important than making sure that the credit actually flows to all parts of the corporate sector. And I think that's what I think we need to do.
Arvind, two ideas which you had advocated. One was creating a bad bank, and the other was universal UBI, right? Universal
basic income.
Benefit
basic income.
Income. You think it's time to think on these two lines? The bad bank, which will just take all the debts, what bad debts away, and you start almost sort of anew, in this kind of a thing, because as you're saying that there are too many balance sheets which are now completely, there's red ink spilt over, including households. You think both these things, UBI and bad banks, whether that's the time has come now for the government to think?
So let me kind of little bit separate these two, because I want to talk about universal basic income in the broader context of, so far we've been focusing on all the challenges of the current crisis, the present crisis. I think we should also think about how this crisis, as you said yesterday, Harish, is this a 1991 moment? The crisis as an opportunity to do lots of, very important things, which the crisis actually facilitates. That's the piece Devesh and I wrote in the Indian Express. We'll come to that in a second. But I think on the financial system, I think there is no doubt in my mind now that the bad bank idea has to be, resuscitated, because we have to make a clean break with the past on the financial system. Now, I think we should be open to whether, because what we had advocated was that the bad bank should first begin with the power sector and the real estate sector for some particular reasons, for special reasons associated with these sectors. So whether we start like that as special cases and then move on to something broader, because I don't think the bad bank can be the only response for the financial system. I think we have to do that, but I think we also, maybe the liquidations will have to happen quickly, bankruptcy will have to happen much more quickly, maybe some quick haircuts will have to be given. Take firms which were viable before, right? But because of the crisis got some extra hit, which was not their fault, maybe we need to find quick ways of giving them haircuts so that they restore to viability again. But some cases like power and real estate, I think there's no doubt in my mind that something like a bad bank, clean, start afresh, where coordination is required. I think certainly we need to be thinking about that as well.
On UBI?
Yeah, no, let's, but if you have other questions, but then we can move to the crisis as an opportunity point.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to check, coming to more practical aspects of, say, lockdown. So May 3rd is supposedly the date when the second phase of the lockdown ends. Right now, that has been announced. But as we approach towards that date, you realize that many of the cities or big industrial centers are the places where the pandemic is there's a heavy load. So these are the red zones. So how do you reconcile with the fact that a large percentage or a large number of urban centers which are still not out of the woods as far as resolving the pandemic itself, or flattening the curve, so to say, continue to be in the red zone, and it's largely the rural areas, or large part of the rural areas, which are in the green zones. So this rebound activity, how do you see that happening post May 3, when much of the urban centers is still under a lockdown?
So yeah, very good question. So if you think about the impact of the pandemic crisis, right? Nothing is good. They're all kind of different degrees of bad. But I think that in a relative sense, the rural economy is going to be hurt relatively less. It's the urban service economy that's going to be hurt the most, even coming back. Think of it, all the sports events, the religious events, retail, restaurants, weddings, the thing of India as a hub of activity relies upon, contacting. So I think that urban services sector and some of the industrial hotspots that you said are going to be, the most challenging coming back. Now here, I think 2 or 3 things I think we need to, keep in mind. When we exit from the lockdown, I think we have to take a serious call on the migrant workers. I think both from a kind of humane point of view, but also from a kind of cold, long-run logic, I think we should allow, early on, allow the possibility for these urban migrant workers to return to their homes, if possible, if they choose to do so. But that avenue should be kept available. And of course, the humanitarian reasons are obvious, right? And I think the 2 economic reasons for doing that also are, look, you take some pressure off places where they are to provide the services which are difficult, whereas if they go back, that'll be easier. But I think the important point also is that, look, when we think about the long run, we want India to be a place where migration takes place. But if we are going to create a situation where the migrant's decision is going to be, oh my God, in bad times, it's really a very bad option, then we will actually make India a less dynamic and a less mobile place. So it's one of those things, right? I mean, we know easy exit, comfort of exit means incentive to enter. Exit and entry are paradoxy. So here, allowing migrants to exit and go back is actually going to be good for the long run economy. Of course, we have to make sure that when they return, how we deal with migrants, I think we have to, completely have a fresh look at. But I think this is, for me, one of the big decisions on this red zone, green zone business has to be, of course, social distancing, gradual, and these are all decisions that I think, nobody can say in advance how to do them. They have to be taken at the local level. There will be a lot of trial and experiment, and it's going to depend upon testing. I mean, especially in the red zones, I think the need to test is going to be, otherwise you can't sustain the relaxation, because then the virus comes back. So decisions on migrants, case by case, and I think one should leave these decisions more and more to local, local states, local bodies, because they're the best. Give them whatever financial support that's necessary. But I do think that on the migrant thing, there has to be a coordination across states, making available the transport, maybe whatever, it requires a lot of central coordination. And I think that's going to be a very important, I think.
Exactly. So if I can throw open the floor to some of our participants in this Express Adda, may I request Mr. Rakesh Biani, Managing Director of Future Retail, if he's there, if you would like to ask a question. Yeah. Mr. Biani.
Good evening, sir. And I've met up with you once before while we were there in the office. Just a quick question, sir. At this time in our lives, I think you rightly mentioned retail is going to be significantly impacted. One of the thoughts was the fact that what are the options that are available to the government in order for raising capital in this country? For a very long time, we have been sort of against the idea of opening up all the FDIs in this country. Because FDI got to be a good mechanism to allow the government to sort of attract capital and allow the economy to sort of kickstart at the earliest. And of course, in my sector, which is retail, where policies have been really merged with all kinds of ideas which just don't make sense there. So that's the only question that I really have.
Yeah, see, I think that until a year or two ago, I think the government was progressively relaxing FDI quite substantially, quite a lot. Of course, there was some reversal on this when it came to the retail sector and online e-retailing and so on, right? I think those were some policy reversals and uncertainty that took place. I think, encouraging FDI, foreign direct investment, as opposed to hot money. Hot money, I think, is a different thing altogether. But I think there is no doubt that having more foreign direct investment is going to be kind of almost unambiguously good. Obviously, there'll be some security things which we need to check. But otherwise, I think we should be very open to FDI. I think we should, there is a dimension of FDI that I think we should keep in mind when we look at the Indian landscape. Look, we don't want excessive concentration in any industry. We don't want only 2 or 3, cell phone providers, 2 or 3 whatever. We need, competition in all our markets, and that way FDI also, apart from whatever it brings, it also provides the competition that keeps a check on any monopoly or actions by incumbents in these markets. Large incumbents in any markets are, I think, detrimental to growth, productivity, efficiency, and FDI has that extra benefit of actually providing that competition. That's another reason why I think we should be open to FDI.
We have a question from Mr. Sugato Bhattacharya, who's Chief Economist with Axis Bank. Yeah. Mr. Bhattacharya?
Hello?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, again. So this is, as usual, Dr. Subramanian, excellent, very, very to the point. I just had a follow-up question on something that you mentioned on the need for fiscal support, both to credit as well as for other stimulus measures. Now, the problem is, from what I see, given the extent of income loss that might possibly happen if the lockdown in particular extends beyond a certain point, domestic borrowers will probably not be able to, domestic institutions and investors will not be able to support the size of the fiscal stimulus that will be required. So inevitably, whichever way you slice it, at some point in time, this fiscal support will need to be supported in some form or the other by the Reserve Bank of India, by the central bank, and we are already seeing this happening in almost all economies across the globe. So are you comfortable with this, RBI supporting the fiscal deficit, both in secondary markets, which I think is relatively less problematic, and particularly in the primary markets, where there is a lot of concern about monetizing the deficit. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we kind of discussed that to some extent in response to Harish's question. Just to briefly repeat, you're right that the ability to have more government financing will run up against who will buy these bonds. That's why I said first we shouldn't just rely on that. We should also have expenditure cuts, foreign financing. And then on this question of the monetary financing, as I said, that we can't do it irresponsibly. I think we should, but there is a way in terms of magnitudes and in terms of making sure that it's one-off. I think there is a sense in which we can do it. We can't do it to the same extent as advanced economies, because remember, in those economies interest rates are very, very low. But we can do it to some extent with all the safeguards. And at some level, if you think about it, there is a big legal difference between the RBI doing it in secondary markets and directly, but the economic effects are not that different. So let's not at this stage get too caught up in these kind of fine legal points. Responsibly, up to a certain amount, favoring the states, I think some amount of monetary financing can be done responsibly in India.
Hi, Anant, you would like to ask a question?
With the benefit of hindsight, Dr. Subramanian, 4 years, the advice you gave, had you known there was something like this that was going to come up, anything you would have advised differently?
The honest answer is, apart from maybe Bill Gates or someone who saw the pandemic coming, I cannot at all say that I saw anything like this coming. Although what I would say is that, had we acted sooner on the twin balance sheet challenge, I think our resilience and our ability to deal with some of these issues would certainly have been better. And so just broadly having an economy that was growing more rapidly, where the financial system was less burdened by all these bad debts, I think that is what looking back one could have done. Maybe better, maybe a kind of even cleaner GST, all those things that, we were talking about, creating the basis for, JAM, what the question that Harish asked, had we kind of completed that architecture, that also would have been allowed us to, cope with this crisis better. But anticipating the crisis, I don't think.
What about the fiscal side? Would you, the fiscal, you were very particular about keeping the fiscal numbers down. And I think the Prime Minister shared that vision with you. Would you think in hindsight we should have let fiscal slide a little bit more, deficit slide a little bit more, or should we have been even more prudent than we were?
Actually, just here's the question, right? I think that in 2015, 2016, and so on, the big debate was, the economy was kind of also slowing down. So I think that my own view then was actually that we should, because private investment was weak, our balance sheets were weak, I felt we should have had a less aggressive path of consolidation than we ended up having. Now, was I right then? Would I change my mind? No, because I think that, the other big thing, of course, is that, just to muddy the waters a little bit, had we known then that our economy was weaker than what we thought it was because of the whole, numbers issue, I think that, we would have been more forceful in the policy response, whether it's on the twin balance sheet, whether it was GST, whether it was other reforms, whether it was actually stimulating the economy more. I think that's what would have kept us resilient going forward.
Yep. May I request Swati Piramal, Vice Chairperson of Piramal and Enterprises.
Sir, you said that you should test more people and then that will help in the lockdown. However, that's a limitation of machines, of kits, of chemicals, and the antibody tests are really well known to give false positives, and therefore that's been suspended. See, Germany and Korea made all those, and therefore they could quickly ramp it. We, unfortunately, are already at a limited quantity of testing. So there's no way we can test billions of people before we'll do a lockdown. So we have to find some other strategy and think about how we should do it. It's not that easy as saying, okay, let's ramp up testing.
So, I think that's a very fair point. I think that our capacity is limited, but all I'm saying is that, so there is a decision about, given limited capacity, how should we, allocate the testing? Should we focus on super spreaders? Should we randomize? Or all those questions arise. But, I think there has to be a simultaneous effort, on the part of government, coordinated with all the state governments, with international cooperation. We cannot, I'm not saying that unrealistically we can produce the extra testing capacity, but I'm saying that we must work on expanding the testing capacity to the maximum possible amount on a high priority basis. It's as high priority, I would say, as, the health response and the stimulus response, because that's what, in a sense, is going to make our exit from the lockdown, carefully done, correctly done, effectively done, and sustainably done.
Yeah. May I request, we have with us Ambassador of Denmark, Mr. Freddie Swain. Mr. Swain, can I request you to ask a question?
Thank you very much indeed. I have two questions. First and foremost, you said that crisis is an opportunity. Is there also an opportunity in India? Secondly, we have learned that India, the center...
Should I come back to Mr. Swain?
Yeah, you can't hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Secondly, the other question relates to the fact that the center and the states have embarked upon perhaps the best cooperation ever in modern India's history. Do you think that this cooperation and the ability of center and states to adapt regulatory frameworks in order to cope with all these challenges will help India building up a new future and making India even stronger? Last question, what about free trade? Is that an option for the new India? Thank you very much.
Okay, let me take two of those questions and maybe come back to the free trade later on if there are other questions. I think the crisis turning to opportunity, I very, very strongly believe in. This is a question that, Harish also asked. We wrote a whole piece on this, Devesh Kapoor and I, but let me just focus on, maybe two aspects of turning crisis. You see, remember, I don't want to, say that, just repeat all the things we need to do, which we should have done for the last, 20, 30 years. But I want to focus on those things that actually the crisis will make more possible. Let's focus on those aspects. I would say one is the whole universal basic income that we spoke about. We have this architecture, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile. It's not a perfect, it's not a full. If we convert it into something that can actually reach every household in India, we create the basis for universal basic income. Now, the other thing, I think the new idea that Devesh and I had, when people, one pushback against universal basic income has always been, do we have the fiscal resources to afford something like a universal basic income? So what we've said now is that we need some solidarity today in terms of, and you've seen that solidarity. I think the fact that, government servants are willing not to have a dearness allowance increase is kind of, is their way of expressing solidarity, because they have secure jobs. Hundreds of millions have been thrown out of jobs. So that's their way of contributing. But can we turn this short-term solidarity into a long-term social compact? And supposing we wanted a universal basic income, how do we finance it? And I think our new idea is that we should use, wealth taxes, elimination of middle-class subsidies, property taxes, find, new and effective ways of levying these taxes and dedicating those resources to financing a universal basic income. Remember, this was FDR's, President Roosevelt's great genius, political genius, was to say, look, I will raise some taxes and use it for some purposes. It violates all laws of public economics because, tax revenues are, they just go into one pot of money. But he kind of created a fiction saying this money will go for this purpose. And what we are saying is something similar, saying, why can't the rich and those who have secure jobs, contribute a little as part of the long-run social compact to, help all those who are more vulnerable, who are more poor, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this crisis creates that opportunity. The second one, which I want to focus on, is that I think, to be honest, even I hadn't realized, completely overlooked the whole role and situation of urban migrants in our economy. I think we had vastly underestimated, how many there were and what the situation was in terms of, what amenities they were getting, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this crisis really says, look, can we think about them in a different way? For example, can we move away from place-based social benefits, like, even today, PDS is place-based, cash transfers are place-based. Can we go from place-based to person-based, social security? And that would give a completely different way of thinking about migrants in India, because, as I said, we want more migration, not less. There are other things that I don't want to bore all of you, but on the center states question, I would kind of resist the notion that this is the first time it's ever happening. For me, even in the last 5 years, the greatest example of center-state cooperative federalism was the passage of the goods and services tax. I mean, there, center and states came together, all of them gave up their sovereignty in order to have this. I mean, we can talk about how well it was implemented, what could be changed, and so on. But that, I think, and Mr. Jaitley and I used to often talk about, and he kind of completely agreed with me on this, that the kind of wistfulness I have, that had that cooperative federalism been extended to agriculture and power, I think we could have maybe have done a lot more reforms. And what this crisis is doing is saying, look, we can do that. In a crisis, we are coming together. Why can't we again make this more sustainable and use it in the future to resolve all those other thorny issues that we have? Water, agriculture, power. All of these require. Take the power sector, for example. You cannot solve India's power sector problems unless the center, the states, the central regulator, the state regulators, the RBI, and the banks come together to solve the power problem. So no, this is not the first time it's happened, but yes, this is a wonderful opportunity to cement this going forward for all other areas of center-state cooperation.
Thank you. Can I request Mr. Arun Kejriwal, founder of Kejriwal Research and Investment Services, to ask his question?
So, Doctor, India is a country which has two opportunities ahead of it. The first one, of course, is the manufacturing, a global manufacturing hub, which we have been talking about now for over last 2-3 years. A lot of changes were made in our various acts last year to encourage that. I believe COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to actually introduce on a war footing manufacturing. The second strength that India has demonstrated is our large capability to be a service center. Now, in these two areas, what do you think is the opportunity that COVID has given us?
Yeah, so let me focus on the first one because it's part of what we wrote of converting crisis to opportunity. Okay, I think first we should be honest and realistic. For about 5 years, everyone has been saying that China is becoming more and more uncompetitive because it's become very successful. Wages are rising. It's no longer the cheapest place to produce lots of labor-intensive manufacturing. And this has been going on for 5-6 years. Everyone said, India should be the destination where all that investment should come away from. But the truth is, it wasn't happening. It was going to Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Ethiopia. So we were not taking advantage of that. And that was despite all the efforts made under the Make in India program. So to say again that, let's make use of this opportunity, I think is very well, but you have to have something to back it up and say, why will it be different this time? But I think Devesh and I have a particular sector, I think, where we can really, test this, do it well, and then maybe extend it to other sectors. And that is the opportunity which actually not has been thrown up, but has been revealed by the COVID crisis, which is that India once upon a time used to be a big producer of the API in pharmaceuticals, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Over time, the world has realized that China is kind of the world's largest supplier of these active ingredients, and that reliance has become a vulnerability for the rest of the world. So I would say that this is an opportunity in pharmaceuticals to actually say, look, let's go back, let's create a genuine Make in India, encourage, that would involve government, states, and the industry coming together, going on a war footing to say, how do we build this, pharmaceutical capability in India, which I think will be very good for the long run as well. So I think that's a specific example where we can take one particular sector, a real opportunity created by the crisis, and then if it works, then we can think of extending it to other sectors like, electronics, clothing, footwear, whatever. But in those sectors, we haven't been successful. And we need to, I think, maybe try it out in one sector and then extend it elsewhere.
Dr. Subramanian, before I let others ask questions, there's something which I thought I must ask you. Tell us about your own lockdown experience in Boston. What's the one tip that you would like to share with us? Would you like to give us? And hopefully you are also not looking at following President Trump's ideas on detergents and UVs.
No. Thankfully, my wife and I, we don't have a television for one thing, so we don't. But see, I think that the one thing that I am enjoying about the lockdown, firstly, of course, it's allowing me to write more and read more. But I have I've acquired a Kindle now, which I didn't have because the last year I was going to the library. The university has a lovely library here, but I don't have access to it anymore. So now I bought a Kindle, and that is kind of also helping me a lot. Reading things that I should have read long ago. So I think the whole reading is keeping me. The reading and writing is keeping me actually very, mentally and kind of thing active. And I'm actually not, I think many of us, I think at this stage should say that we're actually so blessed to be able to do these things and not have to worry about, where our next meal is coming from. So I think that it only reinforces the thing that, that we need a new solidarity, a social compact between those who have and those who are much more precariously off. So, my own personal comfort is almost, irrelevant in this whole business.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. May I request Mr. Yoginder Alak, Vice Chair, Sardar Patel Institute, to ask his question? Mr. Alag?
Yep, he's there.
Yes, Professor Alak?
I'll come back to Professor Alag. Can I request Anand Piramal to put forward his question?
Yeah.
Hello, good evening, sir. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yes. Sir, thank you for a great talk. I had two questions. One is, what's your forecast of the economic growth for the year? And secondly, you work so closely with the government, and we've seen often politically they move very swiftly and quickly. For instance, I think the lockdown was timely. It was perhaps, it felt that the Prime Minister moved pretty decisively. But on economic policies such as addressing the twin balance sheet problem or giving this 5% stimulus, they've been a little bit slower. So what's the mindset? Is there some restriction that they have that it's hard for all of us to see?
Yeah, thanks a lot for those questions, Mr. Piramal. See, on the first one, I don't want to get into trouble. I've gotten into a lot of trouble with talking about GDP growth numbers. But all I will say is that, and this is not a forecast, I think policy making should proceed. It would only be responsible and prudent to allow for the possibility that in this year, growth is substantially negative. That's not a forecast. I'm not saying that's what will happen. But if you look at what has been projected for advanced countries that have taken similar lockdown policies and that are not stimulating the economy much more than we are, I think we should, and given the fact that we were already weak, I think we should plan prudently as if we will have negative or substantially negative growth rates. I think that's not a forecast. It's just how we should, plan policy, by way of prudent economic management. See, on this, as you know, I'm not privy to government motives and intentions and so on. But if you think about it, you see what happened in the global financial crisis in 2008-9, right? I think then the government had a very large fiscal response. Deficits got out of hand. Inflation got out of hand, and we almost had a major crisis in 2013. So I think the memory of that, i.e. that you can do too much and pay the consequences down the road, I think must be at the back of policymakers' minds. I'm not saying it is, but that's one way I'm trying to understand kind of what is going on. I do think, however, the circumstances are different. I think, therefore, I would say that we could do more by way of stimulus, especially in terms of the insurance, in terms of helping, large parts of the private sector, SMEs, small companies, and also big companies. I think we could do more. But my sense as to why perhaps we're not doing as much as we should, just one hypothesis, it's not a kind of a definitive explanation. Just a hypothesis is, I was doing my own thought experiment, and that experience of the global financial crisis provides for me some clue as to why, government is reacting the way it did.
Yeah, may I request Leena Tiwari to ask a question?
Maybe we should go to the next person.
Yeah, let's go to the next one. Can I request Mudit Jain, Managing Director of DCW, to ask his question? DCW Limited.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, Mudit.
Yeah.
So, sir, I believe taxes should be abolished, indirect taxes like GST and capital gains tax, as it will lead to greater consumption, spending power in citizens, leading to greater consumption and greater circulation of velocity of money. Isn't this better than a big stimulus by the government, as it's akin to building many small check dams than one big rather than one big gigantic dam, sir?
See, I would at this stage be a little careful about all these things. Let me say why. There's a kind of economic logic to why something like a GST elimination or cut is not the right thing to do at this stage. Now, leave aside the fact that, you do it, you certainly don't want to do it on a permanent basis, because, the GST, we need the GST on a permanent basis. So I take it you're arguing it should be done on a temporary basis. Even there, I think why I would be reluctant is the following. What is, I think, unusual about this crisis, if you think about it, is that some amount of reduction in activity and consumption is part of the policy response to the crisis. When you do social distancing, when you prevent people from going to restaurants, that's a conscious, deliberate choice. So this is not a normal situation where you want to do stimulus, because you can't. By definition, there are going to be restrictions on how you can meet this demand. So you want to choke demand to some extent in this crisis, because you cannot have the supply. So that's why a pure stimulus by way of a tax cut, which in normal circumstances might have been good policy, in this crisis is not good policy, because this is a shock both to demand and supply, and you want to keep, by definition, activity down. If you stimulate consumption, maybe remember, and maybe once you do this in stages, you want to stimulate consumption at a later stage when you're really exiting from the lockdown. You can't have stimulating consumption and a lockdown at the same time, because that would be counterproductive.
May I request Rabha Bijapurkar to ask a question?
Hi, Dr. Subramanian.
Hi.
At this phase, as this phase of lockdown ends, we're staring and we're struggling much more with the lives versus livelihoods question, the choices, which so far have been fairly obvious. Are there points of no return that you want us to watch out for? Where there's where the damage to the economy and to the future livelihoods will be a point from where we can't recover. Can you point us to any guardrails or metrics or whatever to watch out for, saying, if you hit this, then reverse?
Well, that's a very thoughtful question. I just hope, I think we will not have reached any of these points of no return, anywhere. I mean, remember that, of course, one big thing is that, we can't let the pandemic get out of control, because then you can reach points of no return with the pandemic. I mean, we don't want, cases to come back and deaths to start rising once again. So clearly that has to be something that we have to be careful about. I do think even if we don't reach points of no return, I do think that there are, extreme situations you do want to avoid. I mean, you don't want people to go hungry. You don't want people to, starve. You don't want people to be in conditions that are, unhygienic, that has, long run consequences. I mean, you do want people to, go back to the comfort of some security they may have, which means, we have to, deal with migrants appropriately. And on the production side, you don't want to kill capacity permanently in whether it's the big company or the small company. So that is why I think we need to also make sure that productive capacity is not permanently impaired. So rather than, I think, thinking of markers which define points of no return, I would rather we act to ensure that we don't get to those points of no return, whether on the health side or on the economic and the humanitarian side.
May I request Mr. Niranjan Hiranandani to ask his question? Chairman and Managing Director of Hiranandani Constructions.
Good afternoon, sir. There are two questions, really. The first question is that the Reserve Bank of India has increased credit availability to the banking system. But what we read is actually the reverse. 6.9 lakh crores is lying in reverse back with the Reserve Bank instead of lending into the marketplace. Do you think some sort of a credit guarantee scheme needs to be done by the government in order to improve the lending into the marketplace, for the simple reason that if credit does not come into the marketplace, according to me, there is no way by which the machine which has actually slowed down is likely to come. So that's the first question. The second question is that the government of India and the PSUs have to pay income tax refunds, VAT refunds, GST, NHAI, fertilizer subsidies, payment to state governments of more than 2.2 lakh crores, which is outstanding. Isn't it time that at least those monies were paid under the stimulus package, because that is anyway a liability which is due? And don't you think that could be the first start of getting the stimulus package?
Okay, they're both very good questions. In fact, I spoke extensively about the first point. I think you're absolutely right that the RBI has provided a lot of liquidity, but it hasn't translated into actual credit flowing to companies. And I spoke about that in terms of what the constraints are. I think the two constraints are just who makes those decisions, and I think we need a lot of protection for people to make those decisions. And second, who bears the risk of that lending? And to me, there is no doubt in my mind that that risk of that lending should in this situation be borne by the government, and whether it's via a credit guarantee scheme or really a separate government fund like has been done. You know that in the United States, there was a $650 billion fund for providing to small businesses, and it got consumed within a week or so, and there's a fresh package. So it could take the form of a credit guarantee or absolutely dedicated funds made available by the government. But you still have this question of how will it then be provided and made available as credit to these companies? I think that is the bigger challenge, and I think there are ways of doing this. For example, you could say, mechanical rules, like if you're a AAA company, you can get so much. If you're a little bit lower, you get so much. The point is that you have to minimize discretion in that decision making, because otherwise, the people making those decisions are very afraid, they're very fearful that later on, the 4Cs can come after them. And so that protection on those decisions is as important as, I think, the government making available the money. Of course, the other possibility is that that credit risk is taken by the RBI. For example, the RBI can buy corporate bonds or other paper. That's, I think, would be going into new territory. I think it's going to be a little bit more bold and courageous. But even before going there, I think there are lots of ways. But I think we need to provide those protections to people who are going to make those decisions. On the arrears, I think it's a very fair point. You see, I mean, I don't have a good enough, reliable estimate of what the arrears that the government has to government. I'm sure there are, but I do think that one way of actually helping the private sector at this stage would be to make available, would be to make good on those arrears. I think that would be a good suggestion and a kind of quick, easy way of kind of pumping money into the corporate sector.
Dr. Subramanian, something which we have heard from so many people very often is this, it's a common refrain, which is almost a cliche now, that the world is not going to be the same place hereafter. Is it too melodramatic, or do you think that there will be certain fundamental shifts in the world going ahead?
Yeah. See, I think this is one can talk about this for a long time. It's certainly a defining moment, I think, on a lot of things. Let me make a conceptual point and spell out 3 or 4 areas where I think things are going to be very different. I think what crises do like this is some countries actually use this as an opportunity and do this, come out of it much better. But often what happens in a lot of cases, that the crisis actually kind of magnifies and helps realize pre-existing vulnerabilities. If you were weak before, you come out even weaker afterwards. If you were polarized before, maybe you come out even more polarized afterwards. So I think aggravating pre-existing vulnerabilities is, I think, what crises tend to do, unless kind of decisive action is taken. I think that, having said that, I think 3 big questions in which the way might be different. Globalization, that's a question that people ask. I do think there is going to be, I don't know whether there's going to be less or more, but certainly on some aspects of globalization, we are going to see a reversal. I think, reliance on China, I think, is going to come down across the board, and therefore that means more deglobalization. Migration, I think the whole, worker movement, I think, is going to be different. How we regulate foreign direct investment probably is going to end up being more conservative. So I think globalization is going to be different. The second thing, of course, is this whole surveillance state. I mean, the fact that to deal with pandemics, you need to have a more intrusive state to be effective. Does that get, does the world become what I would call a surveillance on steroids states across the board? And there, I think the whole point I made earlier is going to probably, I don't know for sure, states that were always already, moving in that direction, whatever, you can pick your country around the world, those might get more in that direction. Whereas, countries which have more checks and balances will also move in that direction, but hopefully with more, curbs on the use, on the untrammeled use of state power via surveillance. I think that, so globalization state, and then of course, this whole move towards populism and, illiberalism. I think that, again, I think is an open question. But the last thing I would say, and my next piece that I'm writing is in fact on this, I think that the United States, Europe, and China, this crisis is going to make all of them weaker internally. The United States, we've seen, I think their response to the crisis has been amongst the worst in the world. I mean, if you look at, the US population and the share of its COVID cases and deaths, it's just staggering, right? It's about 4-5% of the world's population, but about 25% of the deaths, and this is the richest country in the world. And that has a lot to do with the polarization. I think China also, that whole social compact between citizens and society and the state, where basically citizens have said, we're willing to have less freedom and liberty for more prosperity and order that the state has provided, especially since 1978. That contract, I think, is going to look a much more shaky in China because, they've not been so effective at dealing with that. So I think these are, big questions, but don't necessarily hold your breath for, kind of dramatic changes, because I think these are things that will probably happen slowly over time. But I think what is going to mark out countries is to what extent they convert crisis into opportunity. Those are going to be the ones to watch. Yeah. And one last point, of course, is that the last point is that, if you take India, for example, it's clear that, Kerala has been outstanding in its response to this, at least in a relative sense. I think that creates its own opportunity, the good opportunity for all other states to say, look, this is the way we should run our public health systems. And, that's another way in which I think positive change, even locally within India, I hope will happen.
Dr. Subramanian, just to follow up, since you mentioned Kerala, what do you make of these low positivity rates in India? Also the deaths, the number of deaths have been, compared with any other part of the world, the number of deaths have also been very low. So what do you make of these numbers?
See, I think a cardinal rule for people who speak in public is not to speak on things that they don't know enough about. I'm not an expert on the epidemiology side, so I shouldn't speak. The only thing I will say is that on the cases we don't know, because it depends on how extensive we are testing it. But I have found it. I have been struck by the fact that the death curve in India has, the number of deaths has been, or rather put it differently, one can see why understating of cases might happen, or for, not because people are suppressing it, but because we're testing less. But I think it's much more difficult to suppress deaths. And the fact that, if the death count is, kind of, not very far away, the true one from what we're reporting, then I think it does carry some implications for the spread of the disease and so on. But I'm not the expert on this.
Abhipriya Kaviratna, would you like to ask your question? May I request Srinath Sridharan to ask his question?
Yeah.
Hi, Doctor.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, please go ahead.
And I have a question. As the lockdown opens up and as the businesses come back to, let's say, the new normal, or come back to their older forecast, try to hold up to their headcount and the business plans, what is the little signs, the danger signs that we need to watch out for? Some of the sectors might try to revive just to keep up the pace with, we are a capitalist world, so the pressures of the stock market, the pressures of holding up the stock prices, the investor sentiment, what are those red alerts to watch out for? Thank you.
Firstly, I think, when we get, whether we'll ever get back to the old normal, I think is an open question. And even if we do, how quickly that will happen is probably, one shouldn't be over optimistic on that. But in terms, see, some of the things I would worry about are things like the following, right? Supposing, say 2 quarters from now, we know by definition that there will be a rapid, the headline growth numbers at some point will look fantastic by definition. You go down a lot, you will come up, even if you come up something. And I just worry more about any sense of complacency that we might draw from all the way the indicators turn out. So my biggest worry going forward is, any sense of complacency that, it's easy to get back to the normal, things are fine, we've come out of the crisis. I think there is, we should be realistically, aware of the fact, for example, on the corporate side, something that Vedi mentioned early on, our NPAs, our stressed assets, the state of the financial system is by definition going to be much worse. Purely because of this shock and the pre-existing vulnerabilities. So so at some point, when growth picks up, say, oh, everything is fine, kind of the world is back to normal. I think that would be what I would worry about. Of course, apart from the whole, you open up and the cases start surging once again. I think that's another complacency, but that will be a little bit more obvious, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, so much for all the time that you took for us. It is really, I think, the breadth of the discussion was really, really fantastic.
I mean, it was really
thank
good.
you so much. May I also thank our sponsor, UCO Bank, and all the participants who could make it for the webinar. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Yeah? And good luck. And I hope, both on the health side, the economy side, we start doing, things start looking up.
Thank you. Thank you.